They found it on a Tuesday morning in March, 11 feet below a soybean field in Linn County, Kansas. The excavation crew wasn't looking for it. They were clearing foundation space for a grain storage expansion when the backhoe operator felt his bucket catch on something that wasn't soil. He backed off, thinking it was limestone ledge. But the resistance had a different quality. Metal. Buried metal. He called his foreman over, and they spent the next 40 minutes carefully removing dirt by hand until the shape became clear. It was a tractor. A large one. Fully intact. Nose down at a 40-degree angle, cab crushed flat, but the rear axle, transmission housing, and engine block still recognizable. The paint was gone. The tires were rotted into black fragments, but the iron was solid, and cast into the front of the engine block, still legible under 2 decades of rust and clay, were the words, Massey Ferguson 2775. Nobody on that crew had ever seen one in person. The 2775 was a machine from a different era. Built in the late 1970s, it was one of Massey Ferguson's biggest row crop tractors before the company shifted design philosophy in the 1980s. This wasn't a museum piece. It was a working machine that had been buried deliberately, completely, and then forgotten. The property owner, a man named Carl Tebbe, stood at the edge of the excavation pit and stared at it for a long time. He'd owned this land for 11 years. Before him, it had belonged to a family named Coker, who sold it in 2013 after their father passed. Carl had never met the man. The sale had gone through an estate attorney, and the Coker children had moved out of state years earlier. There was no mention of equipment, no stories about a tractor. Nothing in the title search, the soil reports, or the survey work suggested anything had been buried here. But here it was, 11 feet down. And Carl wanted to know why. He made a phone call that afternoon to a man named Dennis Falk, a semi-retired equipment restoration specialist who ran a shop outside of Garnett, Kansas. Dennis had spent 40 years rebuilding old iron, most of it Alice Chalmers and Oliver, but he'd worked on enough Massey Ferguson machines to know their structure. Carl explained what they'd found, sent pictures, and asked a simple question: could it be recovered? Dennis drove out the next day. He climbed down into the pit, examined the frame rails, checked the front axle mounts, and spent 20 minutes underneath the engine block with a flashlight and a wire brush. When he climbed back out, he told Carl 3 things. First, the frame was intact. Second, the engine hadn't cracked. Third, if Carl was serious about bringing it up, it was going to take a crane, a flatbed, and at least 2 weeks of prep work before they even thought about moving it. Carl said yes. The recovery took 9 days. They used a combination of hydraulic jacks, steel cable, and a 30-ton crane to stabilize the machine before lifting. The soil had compacted around the tractor so tightly that removing it required cutting relief channels on both sides just to break the suction. When they finally hoisted it free, the entire frame bent slightly under its own weight, shedding chunks of clay and oxidized metal. They set it on a flatbed, strapped it down, and hauled it to Dennis's shop on a Saturday morning in late March. That's when the real investigation began. Dennis didn't start with the engine. He started with the cab, or what was left of it. The entire structure had been flattened, the roof bent down to the seat level, the glass shattered into powder, but the steering column was still attached, and the instrument panel, though rusted, was readable. The hour meter read 4,790 hours. Not low, not excessively high, consistent with a machine that had been used hard but not worn out. He pulled the seat frame free and found something underneath, a metal toolbox, crushed but still latched. Inside were 3 open-end wrenches, a pair of pliers, a grease gun nozzle, and a folded piece of paper sealed in a plastic bag. The paper had degraded, but the ink was still visible. It was a service record, handwritten, dated July 18, 1996. It listed an oil change, a hydraulic filter replacement, and a note, rear main seal seeping, monitor. That gave them a timeline. The tractor had been in service at least through the summer of 1996, which meant it had been buried sometime after that. But why, and by whom? Dennis began the disassembly process in early April. He started with the exterior components, the fuel tank, the battery box, the exhaust stack. Everything was corroded but structurally intact. He moved to the hydraulic system next, draining what was left of the fluid. It came out as a thick black sludge that smelled like decomposed seals and metal particulate. He cut open the filter housings and found the elements completely disintegrated. Then he reached the transmission. The housing was still sealed. That was unusual. In most buried equipment, water intrusion causes the gaskets to fail and the internals to rust into a solid mass. But when Dennis pulled the inspection cover, the gears were dry. Coated in old oil, yes, but dry. No water, no mud. The transmission had been sealed when the tractor went into the ground, and it had stayed sealed. He made a note of that. The engine came next, a Perkins V8 diesel. 280 horsepower at the flywheel when new. Dennis removed the valve covers first, expecting to find a mess of rust and corrosion. Instead, he found something else. The rocker arms were coated in a thick, waxy residue. It wasn't oil. It wasn't grease. It was something that had been deliberately applied, a preservative compound, the kind used for long-term storage. Someone had prepped this engine before burying it. Dennis called Carl that night and told him what he'd found. Carl asked the obvious question. Why would someone preserve an engine and then bury the entire tractor? Dennis didn't have an answer, but he told Carl he was going to keep going, because now it wasn't just a recovery project. It was a forensic investigation. He pulled the oil pan in mid-April. The process took 2 days because the bolts had fused to the block and required heat, penetrating oil, and patience. When the pan finally came free, Dennis set it on the workbench and stared at the contents. The oil had separated into layers. At the bottom was a dense, tar-like substance. Above that, a lighter fluid that still had some viscosity, and floating on top, a thin film that looked almost metallic. He sent samples to a fluid analysis lab in Wichita. The results came back a week later. The base oil was conventional 15W40 diesel motor oil, consistent with 1990s formulations. But the lab also detected trace amounts of a molybdenum disulfide additive, an extreme pressure lubricant that wasn't standard in agricultural applications. It was the kind of thing used in industrial equipment, mining machinery, or high-load motorsports. Someone had been running custom oil in this tractor. Dennis pulled the cylinder heads next. The combustion chambers were clean. No carbon buildup, no scoring on the cylinder walls. The pistons showed normal wear patterns, but nothing excessive. He checked the bearings. They were still within spec. The crankshaft had no visible damage. Everything pointed to an engine that had been running well when it was shut down. But there was one anomaly. The exhaust valves on cylinders 3 and 6 showed heat discoloration that didn't match the others. Not damage, just discoloration. The kind of thing that happens when an engine runs hotter than normal for an extended period. Dennis made another note. He moved to the fuel system. The injection pump was seized, which was expected, but when he disassembled it, he found that the internal components were coated in the same waxy preservative he'd seen in the valve train. Someone had flushed the system and filled it with a storage compound before the tractor was buried. Carl came by the shop in early May to see the progress. Dennis walked him through everything: the sealed transmission, the preserved engine, the custom oil, the heat patterns on the exhaust valves. Carl asked the question both of them had been thinking: was this tractor stolen? Dennis said he didn't know, but he'd been rebuilding equipment long enough to recognize when something didn't fit, and nothing about this machine fit. It had been maintained, it had been modified, it had been carefully preserved, and then it had been buried under 11 feet of dirt and erased from record. He told Carl there was one way to find out what this tractor had been used for: reassemble it, make it run, and see what it could do. They started the rebuild in late May. Dennis ordered new seals, gaskets, and filters. He fabricated new fuel lines and rebuilt the injection pump. He replaced the clutch, which had rotted into fragments, and installed new hydraulic hoses. The electrical system was a total loss, so he rewired it from scratch using a wiring diagram he found in an old Massey Ferguson service manual. By mid-June, the engine was back together. Dennis filled it with fresh oil, primed the fuel system, and connected a temporary battery. He didn't expect it to start. Most engines that have been buried for 2 decades won't even turn over, but he wanted to see if the starter would engage. He turned the key. The starter motor whined. The flywheel rotated, slowly at first, then faster. Dennis gave it a few seconds, then released the key. The engine didn't fire, but it turned. That meant the internals were free. That meant there was a chance. He spent the next 2 days checking compression, adjusting valve lash, and bleeding the fuel system. On June 18th, he decided to try again. He turned the key, held it, and after 4 seconds of cranking, the engine coughed. Black smoke poured out of the exhaust stack. The engine shuddered, missed, then caught. It ran rough for 10 seconds, smoothed out, and settled into a deep, rattling idle. Dennis stood there and listened. The sound was wrong. Not broken, just wrong. The exhaust note had a resonance that didn't match a stock Perkins V8. It was deeper, heavier, like the engine was working harder than it should at idle. He let it run for 5 minutes, then shut it down. He pulled the valve covers again and checked for leaks. Nothing. He checked the oil pressure, 60 pounds at idle, high but within tolerance. He checked the coolant temperature, normal. Then he did something he hadn't planned. He put a timing light on the injection pump and checked the timing advance curve. What he found didn't match the factory specification. The pump had been recurved. Someone had advanced the injection timing by 4 degrees and increased the fuel delivery rate by approximately 12%. This engine had been modified to produce more power than the factory intended. Dennis called Carl and told him. Carl asked if that was legal. Dennis said it wasn't illegal, but it wasn't standard either. Advancing the timing increased horsepower, but it also increased cylinder pressure, exhaust gas temperature, and mechanical stress. It was the kind of modification you'd make if you needed more pulling power and didn't care about longevity, or if you were competing. Carl asked if Dennis thought this tractor had been used in tractor pulls. Dennis said he didn't know, but the modifications, the custom oil, the heat patterns on the exhaust valves, it all pointed in that direction. They ran the engine 3 more times over the next week, each time for longer durations. By the end of June, it was running smoothly enough to idle for 30 minutes without issue. Dennis installed a temporary hydraulic pump and tested the 3-point hitch. It lifted, slowly, but it lifted. On July 2nd, they decided to take it outside. Dennis had fabricated a temporary drawbar and mounted a set of used rear tires he'd pulled from a salvage pile. They weren't the right size, but they held air. He fired up the engine, let it warm, and eased it into gear. The clutch engaged. The tractor rolled forward, slowly. The transmission whined, the rear end clunked, but it moved. Carl stood in the gravel lot and watched as Dennis drove the Massey Ferguson 2775 in a wide circle. The machine that had been buried 11 feet underground for 19 years was running. Not perfectly, not quietly, but running. Dennis brought it back to the shop and shut it down. He climbed off and told Carl they needed to do a full load test. Not just idling, not just driving in circles. They needed to see what it could pull. Carl knew a farmer 2 counties over who had a dynamometer sled, a weighted drag platform used to test tractor pulling power. He made a call. The farmer said they could use it the following Saturday. They trailered the Massey Ferguson out on July 9th. The Dyno sled was set up in a dirt lot behind a machine shed. The farmer, a man in his 70s named Harlan, had been running pull events since the 1980s. He walked around the tractor, looked at the engine, and asked Dennis if he knew what he had. Dennis said he wasn't sure. Harlan pointed to the injection pump. He said he'd seen that style of modification before. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was an underground pulling circuit that ran through eastern Kansas and western Missouri. Unsanctioned events, no formal rules, just farmers and custom builders trying to see who could pull the hardest. The Massey Ferguson 2775 had been a popular platform because of its V8 engine and heavy frame. He said most of those tractors had been torn apart or sold for scrap after the circuit disbanded in the mid-1990s, but a few had disappeared. He'd always wondered where they went. Dennis asked if Harlan had ever heard of a tractor being buried. Harlan said no, but he'd heard stories about machines being hidden after engine failures, liability concerns, or disputes with sanctioning bodies. He said if this tractor had been running in those events, someone might have had a reason to make it disappear. They hooked the Massey Ferguson to the Dyno sled. Dennis climbed into the seat, started the engine, and let it idle for 2 minutes. Harlan set the sled weight to 18,000 pounds, a moderate load for a tractor of this size. He gave Dennis the signal. Dennis eased the throttle forward. The engine RPMs climbed. The rear tires bit into the dirt. The sled began to move, slowly at first, then steadily. The engine roared. Black smoke poured from the stack. The tractor pulled the sled 30 feet before Dennis throttled back and stopped. Harlan walked over and checked the sled's measurement system. He looked at Dennis and said the tractor had just generated 340 horsepower at the drawbar, 60 horsepower more than factory rating. Dennis shut the engine down and climbed off. He walked to the front of the tractor and stared at the engine block. Carl asked him what he was thinking. Dennis said he was thinking about why someone would bury a machine like this. A machine that worked, a machine that had been built to win. Carl asked if there was any way to trace the previous owner. Dennis said maybe. The serial number was still visible on the transmission housing. He could contact Massey Ferguson's Historical Records Department and see if they had any registration data. It was a long shot, but it was something. Dennis made the call on Monday, July 11th. He spoke to a records specialist in Iowa who explained that Massey Ferguson had digitized most of their pre-2000 sales records, but dealer-level information was incomplete. She took the serial number and said she'd search what they had. It might take a few weeks. The call came back on July 29th. The tractor had been sold new in September 1978 to a farm supply dealership in Paola, Kansas. From there, it had been purchased by a farmer named Raymond Kocher. The address matched the property where Carl now farmed. Carl felt something tighten in his chest. Kocher, the same family that had sold him the land, the same family that had never mentioned a tractor, the same family whose father had died in 2013, right before the estate sale. Dennis asked if Carl wanted to reach out to the Kocher children. Carl said he wasn't sure. He didn't know what he'd say, or what they'd say back, but he also needed to know. He found a phone number for one of the sons, a man named Linn County, who lived in Springfield, Missouri. Carl called on a Thursday evening in early August. Glenn answered on the third ring. Carl introduced himself, explained that he now owned the land, and told him about the tractor they'd found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Glenn said, "So he really did it." Carl asked what he meant. Glenn said his father had been involved in tractor pulling in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Not the sanctioned events. The other kind. The ones that ran on back roads and county fairgrounds with no insurance and no oversight. His father had built the Massey Ferguson 2775 specifically for those pulls. He'd put everything into it. Time, money, modifications. He'd won most of the events he entered. But in 1996, there had been an accident at a pull in Missouri. Not with his father's tractor. Someone else's machine had thrown a drive line and injured 2 spectators. The circuit shut down after that. Liability concerns, legal threats. Most of the competitors dismantled their machines or sold them off. But Glenn's father hadn't. He'd kept the Massey Ferguson. Glenn said his father had talked about entering sanctioned pulls, but the rules were too strict. The engine modifications wouldn't pass inspection, and his father refused to detune it. He'd spent too many years building it to make it slower, so he'd made a different decision. In the fall of 1997, Glenn's father had told the family he was selling the tractor, but Glenn never saw it leave the property. He asked his father about it once, and his father told him it was taken care of. Glenn assumed he'd traded it or scrapped it. He never thought to ask again. Now he knew. Carl asked why his father would bury it instead of selling it. Glenn said he didn't know for sure, but he knew his father. And he knew that tractor meant something to him that no one else understood. It wasn't just a machine. It was proof that he'd built something faster, stronger, and better than anything else in 3 counties. And if he couldn't run it the way it was meant to be run, he wasn't going to let someone else strip it down or turn it into a parts tractor. He was going to make sure it stayed exactly the way he built it, even if that meant putting it in the ground. Carl thanked Glenn for the information. Glenn asked if the tractor still ran. Carl said yes. Glenn asked if he could see it. Carl said yes. Glenn drove up from Missouri on a Saturday in late August. Dennis had finished the restoration by then. The cab was rebuilt. The sheet metal was repainted. The engine ran perfectly. Carl had the tractor parked outside his equipment shed when Glenn arrived. Glenn walked up to it slowly. He circled it twice, ran his hand along the fender, and stared at the engine for a long time. Then he climbed into the seat, gripped the steering wheel, and sat there without saying anything. After a few minutes, he climbed back down. He told Carl his father used to let him sit in that seat when he was a kid, before the pulls, before the modifications, back when it was just a work tractor. He said he remembered the sound it made, the way the exhaust rattled when his father opened the throttle, the way it felt when the rear tires grabbed and the whole machine surged forward. He said he hadn't heard that sound in almost 30 years. Carl asked if he wanted to hear it now. Glenn said yes. Dennis started the engine. It fired immediately, settled into that deep, rumbling idle, and filled the air with the smell of diesel and hot iron. Glenn stood there and listened. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After a few minutes, Dennis shut it down. Glenn shook Carl's hand, thanked him for calling, and walked back to his truck. Before he got in, he turned and said one more thing. He said his father had been right to bury it, because some machines aren't meant to be compromised. Carl watched him drive away, then walked back to the tractor. He stood next to it for a long time, thinking about the man who built it, the man who buried it, and the strange, unspoken logic that connected those two decisions. The Massey Ferguson 2775 sits in Carl's equipment shed now. He starts it once a month. He doesn't use it for work. He doesn't need to. It's not a work tractor anymore. It's something else. A record of what one man was willing to do to prove that he could build something faster than anyone thought possible, and what he was willing to sacrifice to make sure that record stayed intact. Every time Carl fires it up, he thinks about the moment Dennis first turned the key after the rebuild, the moment when an engine that had been underground for 19 years coughed, shook, and roared back to life. Not because it had to, but because it was built well enough that it could. There are farmers in Linn County who know the story now. They've heard about the tractor that was buried 11 feet down and brought back. Some of them think it's a waste. A machine like that should be working, they say, pulling a plow, dragging a disc, earning its keep. But Carl doesn't see it that way. He sees a machine that was built to win, a machine that did win, and a machine that was buried not because it failed, but because the man who built it refused to let it become anything less than what it was. On a cool morning in late September, Carl invited Dennis out to the farm. They stood in front of the equipment shed and looked at the Massey Ferguson. Dennis asked Carl if he ever regretted spending the time and money to bring it back. Carl said no, because some things aren't about money. They're about respect. Respect for the iron, respect for the man who built it, and respect for the idea that winning isn't always about what happens in front of a crowd. Sometimes it's about what you're willing to bury to make sure no one else gets to claim it. Dennis nodded. He understood. They fired the tractor up one more time, let it idle for a few minutes, listened to that deep, heavy exhaust note that didn't sound like anything else on the road. Then they shut it down, locked the shed, and walked back to the house. The Massey Ferguson 2775 is still there, still red, still powerful, still carrying the modifications that made it faster than it had any right to be. And every month when Carl starts it, he thinks about the man who built it, the man who won with it, and the man who made sure it would never lose.